In 1348, in parts of Europe people were buried while they were still alive, not because anyone wanted to, but because no one wanted to get close enough to find out if they were already gone. Families stopped touching each other, children were left behind. Streets went silent overnight, and the worst part, it wasn't the disease, it was what people became when they thought death was everywhere. This is savage century, and this is what really happened during the Black Death. Before the plague, life was already fragile. Most people never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born. Villages were tight. Communities were everything. You knew your neighbors. You trusted them. And when someone got sick, you stayed, you helped, you prayed, you waited. Because that's what people did. Until suddenly, they didn't. To understand what really broke during the Black Death, you first have to understand what was there to break. Medieval Europe of 1340 wasn't primitive. It was a complex system. Guilds, churches, markets, laws, hierarchies. There was order. There was structure. There were expectations about how the world worked. And then, between 1347 and 1351, that world was dismantled. The Black Death, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, killed between 75 and 200 million people. In some places, 2 out of every 3 people died. 2 out of 3. Picture your street. Picture the people you know. Now picture 2/3 of them gone in months. That was the world people woke up to every single day. And that world produced behavior that no law, no faith, and no philosophy had prepared anyone for. Before we go further, if you're new here, this is Savage Century. We dig into the darkest, most uncomfortable corners of real history. The stories they skipped in school. If that's your kind of thing, hit subscribe right now. It's free, and it means a lot. And drop a comment below, tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. All right, let's get back to 1348, because things are about to get a lot worse. Let's start with the doctors. In theory, they were the ones who were supposed to stay. The medical oath, professional ethics. The entire structure of European universities existed for one reason, so that knowledge would serve people in crisis. In practice, the doctors ran. Not all of them, but most. Chronicles from Venice, Florence, and Paris record physicians abandoning patients mid-treatment, closing their offices, leaving entire cities without a single trained medical professional. A physician named Guy de Chauliac, who treated Pope Clement VI in Avignon, wrote with barely concealed bitterness. Medicine was useless, and the physicians were ashamed. He stayed. He contracted the disease. He survived. And he documented the abandonment of his colleagues with cold clinical precision. But the flight of doctors was only the beginning. Giovanni Boccaccio survived the Black Death in Florence. And what he wrote in the Decameron isn't fiction, it's testimony. He described fathers abandoning sick children, children abandoning parents, husbands walking out the door without looking back. These weren't monsters. These were terrified people who understood one thing that the doctors still couldn't explain. Getting close to someone who was sick meant dying, so they chose to live. In Siena, a chronicler named Agnolo di Tura wrote something that historians have quoted for centuries because it's impossible to read without feeling the weight of it. I, Agnolo di Tura, buried my 5 children with my own hands. No one had come to help him. The collapse of the family bond, the most basic structure of any human society, was so fast and so total that cities across Europe were left temporarily without any shared sense of what it meant to be responsible for another person. And when that disappears, what comes next is predictable and horrifying. When people can't explain a catastrophe, they find an explanation. And when they're afraid, that explanation almost always has a face. In 1348, and 1349. As the plague tore through Europe, a theory began to spread. The Jews were poisoning the wells. There was no evidence. There was no logic. Jewish communities were dying from the plague too. But the theory spread faster than the disease itself. What followed was one of the largest massacres in medieval European history. In Strasbourg, in February 1349, 2,000 Jews were forced into a cemetery. Wooden platforms had been built in advance, piles of wood stacked underneath. They were burned alive while the city watched. Those who agreed to convert to Christianity were pulled from the fire. The rest were not. Chronicles describe children being torn from their parents' arms, forcibly baptized, while the adults burned behind them. In Mainz, 12,000 Jews were killed in a single day. In Basel, the entire Jewish community was locked inside wooden buildings, constructed specifically for this purpose. The doors were sealed from the outside and set on fire, while people outside watched. Pope Clement VI issued 2 papal decrees protecting Jewish communities, declaring the poisoning theory was false. European cities ignored the Pope. More than 200 Jewish communities were destroyed between 1348 and 1351. People who were dying from a disease they couldn't control found something they could control: violence against whoever was different, and they exercised that control with an efficiency that the plague itself couldn't match. Not everyone turned their terror outward. Some turned it inward. The flagellants were a movement that exploded across Europe during the Black Death. Groups of men, sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands, marched from city to city, whipping themselves, publicly, not as private penance, as a spectacle. Chronicles describe processions, where participants beat themselves with leather straps tipped with metal spikes, singing hymns, blood running down their backs. Crowds gathered around them, weeping and praying. The logic was simple and absolutely desperate. If God had sent the plague as punishment for human sin, then the answer was to show him exactly how much suffering you were willing to endure. Here's what they didn't understand. The crowds that gathered to watch the flagellants were dense crowds, in close physical contact, sharing the same air. And the flagellants marching city to city were perfect vectors for spreading the disease. The people trying to save their souls through pain were accelerating the death of their bodies, and the bodies of everyone around them, while individuals made desperate choices. The institutions that were supposed to hold everything together simply stopped working. The church, the backbone of medieval European society, lost between a third and half of its clergy. Priests who administered last rites, who sat beside the dying, died at far higher rates than the general population. The result, thousands of people died without any religious rites at all. For medieval Europeans, that wasn't just tragic, it was terrifying. Dying without sacraments meant, in the belief of the time, eternal damnation. Entire cities collapsed administratively. In Florence, the guild system that regulated trade simply stopped. There weren't enough people left to make it function. And when institutions stop, power redistributes, usually to whoever is most willing to use force. In some regions, feudal lords used the chaos to reclaim land and rights they'd lost to growing cities in the decades before. In others, survivor groups established new hierarchies based on 2 simple criteria: who had food and who had weapons. The world that emerged from the Black Death looked the same on the surface, but the rules that governed it had been rewritten in desperation. Here's the paradox that historians still debate today. The Black Death was one of the greatest catastrophes in human history, and it was also, in ways that are twisted and morally complicated, a catalyst for changes that Europe never would have produced on its own. With a third to half the population dead, there was a severe shortage of labor, and the peasants who survived, for the first time in medieval European history, had leverage. They could leave. They could demand higher wages. They could refuse the conditions of serfdom that previous generations had accepted because they had no other choice. The feudal structure, which had kept the majority of Europe's population in conditions of near slavery for centuries, began to crack. Not because of revolution, but because of arithmetic. There simply weren't enough people left for lords to keep demanding the same terms. The European working class gained power because half of its members had died. You can't call that a victory. But you can't ignore the fact that the Europe that came after the plague was, in some fundamental economic ways, more equal than the Europe the plague had found. The horror produced something that centuries of philosophy and religion hadn't managed. A real shift in the distribution of power. The Black Death killed between 75 and 200 million people. But what people did during and after it, the abandonments, the massacres, the mass self-flagellation, the collapse of everything that held them together, that is the most honest record we have of how human beings respond when the world stops making sense. Not with nobility, not with automatic solidarity, with fear, with violence, with the desperate need to find a culprit, an explanation, a way out, even if that way out destroyed other people. And at the same time, with resistance, with the ones who stayed when they could have run, with the ones who buried the bodies when no one else would get close, with the ones who wrote down what they saw so that we, centuries later, could understand. The plague revealed what was already there, in everyone. The question isn't whether you would have been better than them. The question is, when fear takes everything away from you, what would you become? If this story stayed with you, subscribe, because history isn't just about the past. It's about what people are capable of when everything falls apart. And before you go, drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching from? I'll see you in the next one.